Moving on to the third question, is it okay to hurt or to kill someone in self-defense? First of all, let's just say that people who study this sort of thing, self-defense and what do you do when things go south real quick, they will tell you that this is really a moot question, because when you find yourself in a situation where it's life or death, your life or their life, your survival instincts will kick in, and you will do whatever it takes to defend yourself or your loved ones. And so, probably right. So we can talk about it, I guess, from an academic standpoint. We can talk about it from a biblical standpoint. We certainly need to do that. But when a person finds themselves in that situation, your instincts will almost certainly kick in. But with all that said, we're not talking in this question about the war question, which is a separate issue all in itself. We're not talking about whether it's right for a Christian to be a cop. Again, that would be a question all to itself. And I assume that most Christians in both of those cases would not have big objections based on Romans chapter 13 and the role that civil government plays in the lives of the people of God. But what about individual Christians? Is it ever right for a Christian to take the life of another human being? Again, we would all certainly agree if murder is prompted, motivated by personal hatred, by anger, by jealousy, anything like that, then certainly that would be wrong. It would be murder, actually, in the very literal sense of the term. Those passions are themselves sinful. They are among the works of the flesh. In Galatians chapter 5, any behavior that flows from them would certainly be sinful as well. But what if that's not the motive? What if your motive is not hatred or anger or jealousy? What then? I want us to go back to Genesis chapter 9. Somebody immediately says, well, whoa, preacher, you're going back in the Old Testament, doesn't count. Bear with me, please. Just bear with me, work with me through this, and you'll see why we began in Genesis chapter 9. In Genesis chapter 9 and verse 6, shortly after the flood, God sets forth this principle: whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image. Clearly in this passage, whatever it refers to, God justifies the use of deadly force under a very specific set of circumstances, and especially that has to do with the fact that God made man in his own image. Can we just all agree on that? That human life has value, that we are created in the image of God, that Jesus himself said, your soul is worth more than all of the world's goods. And according to Genesis chapter 9, the reason why a murderer deserves to be put to death, that's capital punishment, the reason why the murderer deserves to be put to death is not because his life has no value, but because the life of his innocent victim did have value. That's the principle of Genesis chapter 9. Pretty easy to understand that. When you fast forward through time and you move from the patriarchal age into the Mosaic age, did that principle still carry weight? And the answer is, yeah, it did. It was still very much a valid principle in the days of the Mosaic law. The sixth commandment, thou shalt not kill, depending on which translation you're reading from, many of your modern translations will translate that by the word murder, which is actually a more accurate translation. There were different Hebrew words that would describe those kinds of things. Murder is what's under consideration in the sixth commandment of the 10 commandments, thou shalt not commit murder. And the reason we know that's Exodus chapter 20, because when you read in the very next chapter, you'll see that there were actually a number of offenses that would justify capital punishment, a number of things that individuals could do. We're not going to read through all of those. But in verse 12, chapter 21 and verse 12, whoever strikes a man so that he dies shall be put to death. That sounds a whole lot like Genesis chapter 9 and verse 6, and we would assume it is for the same reason. Why? Because the life of the innocent victim had great worth in the eyes of God. Even in chapter 22, Exodus 22 and in verse 2, if a thief was found breaking in, if he's struck so that he dies, there shall be no blood guilt for him. There were other extenuating circumstances, if it was daylight and so forth, but verse 2 simply says that if he's breaking in the night and he is killed, then the person who did it is not guilty. And again, the reason for all of those provisions is very clear. The life of the innocent victim or the intended victim, in the case of the unfortunate thief, the life was innocent and created in the image of God. It had value. And so the Old Testament, patriarchal age, law of Moses, doesn't matter. It's pretty simple to make the case that, yeah, if somebody's killing you or trying to kill your loved ones, yeah, you have every right to kill them. Won't go into great detail about that, but I think that kind of sets the stage for the rest of the discussion. The principle that you and I are concerned about, of course, is in this Christian age, this Christian dispensation. We can ask the question, are we also created in the image of God? You know the answer to that. Of course we are. Human life still has great value and worth today. And that is, I believe, the reason why God in the New Testament age retained capital punishment as a just response to evil. And you see that in a couple of passages. You certainly see it in Romans chapter 13 and in verse 4. Civil government does not bear the sword in vain. Civil government has a right to execute. That's what swords were used for, to kill people. They have the right. Civil government certainly has the right to kill those who are evil, using the principles of justice that the law of Moses sets forth, of course, and that most civilized societies in this day and time would recognize as well. Another passage, I find this to be very interesting, in Acts chapter 25 and in verse 11. Acts chapter 25 and verse 11, where the Apostle Paul is before Festus and he's giving his defense. And he says, if I have done anything worthy of death, then I do not refuse to be executed. He says, go ahead and execute me if I've done anything worthy of death. Now, what that says is that in the mind of the Apostle Paul, there were some things that were worthy of death, worthy of capital punishment. And so in the New Covenant age, at least as it relates to civil government, I think we have our answer there. Capital punishment is certainly valid. But again, what about Christians? And certainly the question here has to do with Christians on an individual basis hurting or killing someone in self-defense. What about that? We know that Jesus condemned the use of armed force in the furtherance of the kingdom. Our Islamic radicals would do well to listen to what Jesus said on that occasion in Matthew chapter 26, when he tells Peter to put up the sword. For all of those, he says, who take up the sword shall perish by the sword. Or in the very next few hours, as he's standing before Pilate in John chapter 18, and in verse 36, he said, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom was of this world, my servants would fight. They would take up the sword that I should not be delivered up. But my kingdom is not from this world. And so if we're talking about that, then there's no justification for using armed force. We don't spread the borders of the kingdom that way. If you convert somebody at the point of a sword, you haven't really converted them. You've just scared them into the baptistry. And that's not what Christianity is, not how it's spread. But in that same context, about that same time, in the Garden of Gethsemane, he commanded his apostles to arm themselves. This is Luke chapter 22. He commands them to arm themselves. Those, he says, who do not have a sword, sell your cloak and go buy one. Go buy a sword. Now, why would he do that? Some people try to read the next verse where he says that it must be fulfilled, that I will be numbered among the transgressors. And they say, well, there it is. He was wanting to turn his apostles into transgressors by telling them to go and buy a sword. I don't believe it. I don't believe Jesus ever did that, encouraged his own disciples to become transgressors. Really? I mean, is that where we have to go to try to say that that's not what Jesus was talking about here? In Luke chapter 22, when Jesus told his apostles that before, when you were doing the limited commission and you were going from house to house and village to village in Judea and in Galilee, then you had what you needed. But now, as you are about to go out on this great commission beyond the borders of Israel, beyond where the people of God normally would maintain a relatively safe environment, when you get out into the pagan world, think missionary journeys, he says you need to have a sword. Now that's what Jesus is telling his own apostles. If you don't have a sword, you need to go buy one. And the question is, why in the world would Jesus have told them that? And I don't think it's a complicated question at all. If you have a group of men going into a hostile environment, if each one of them has a sword strapped to his side, they're probably going to be left alone. If you find a guy with his wife or a guy with his wife and kids and they've got no weaponry on them, easy pickings for any of the bad guys that would be out there. I believe it was a defensive, prescriptive thing to enable them to journey more safely. To me, that makes the most sense as to the reason why he would encourage them to go and buy a sword. Again, they were not to defend themselves against persecution with the use of those swords. That's certainly not why he did that. That kind of persecution, even in the first century, usually came at the hand of a corrupt civil authority, whether it was the authority of the Jewish leaders or whether it was the authority of the Roman leaders. Most of the persecution in the first century came at the hands of those authorities, and they never were told, we have no example of them ever using their sword against those authorities. We find, in fact, quite the opposite, that they willingly gave in to the authorities that would be responsible for their own deaths. Stephen did. He was stoned to death by the Jewish authorities. James did. He was beheaded by the Roman authorities. And so, yeah, the swords were not used for that purpose. But as a deterrent to the evil threats that they would constantly run into on their numerous evangelistic journeys, that makes a lot of sense. There's an interesting statistic. This comes from a website, gunfacts.info. They didn't have guns back then, but we're talking sort of apples and apples, green apples and red apples, I guess, guns and knives, guns and swords. This particular website says that guns have prevented an estimated 2.5 million crimes per year. 2.5 million crimes per year are prevented by guns. That is, crimes don't happen because somebody had a gun. That's 6,849 a day. And most often they go on to write, the gun is never fired, no blood is shed. What that says is that a gun can be a powerful deterrent when an evil person has evil intent toward you or toward your family. Does that fit the template of what Jesus was saying when he told his apostles to go and buy a sword? I think it fits the template exactly. I believe it's a perfectly rational way to explain why Jesus commanded his apostles to buy a sword. Now, the pushback, of course, comes when we're talking about stuff like this. Didn't Jesus say to turn the other cheek? He did, Matthew chapter 5 and verse 39. But can we just say that was spoken in the context of vengeance? Just like the works of the flesh that we mentioned a little bit earlier, hatred and anger and jealousy, if you do evil things because those are in your heart, that's a problem. If you do evil things in order to take vengeance against someone, that's a problem. And the Bible does warn about that. But let's be clear, protecting innocent life is not taking vengeance. If someone comes into my house and tries to kill my wife or me, if I shoot first, that ain't vengeance. And so what Jesus is talking about there, turning the other cheek's got nothing to do with this conversation. Some others say, well, aren't you supposed to love your neighbor? Yep. By the way, that's an Old Testament prescription, to love your neighbor as yourself. The same Old Testament that gave license for an individual to defend himself against an intruder in the middle of the night, even if it's a lethal response. The same law as the one said, love your neighbor as yourself. That's not a problem in dealing with a question like this. To love your neighbor as yourself, I would just say that's exactly right. And if a bad guy is breaking into my neighbor's house, you say call 911. That can work, probably does work a lot of times in our environment right here in our part of the country. There are a lot of environments where that don't work anymore. 911 can be a 30-minute response or more. Are you really loving your neighbor if you allow the bad guy to harm them, to beat them up, to rape them? Is that love? Is that loving your neighbor? I don't think so. If someone breaks into my house and rapes my wife or takes my daughter and sells her into sex slavery, is it loving to say, hey, I've got another daughter in the other room, you want her too? Nothing loving about that. So don't tell me that turning the other cheek or loving your neighbor as yourself prohibits self-defense. There's no prohibition there, not at all. In fact, I would pity the poor family whose head of the house interprets love this way. Wouldn't want to be married to that guy, I can tell you right now. 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 8, if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially those of his own household, he has denied the faith. He's worse than an infidel. I understand that usually is interpreted in terms of food, clothing, and shelter, and that's certainly a big part of it. Is that the only needs that your family has? Food, clothing, and shelter? That it? If you do not provide for their physical safety, if you allow them to be harmed by an evil individual, are you really doing your duty as the head of the house? I believe you're flatly violating your responsibility as the head of the house per 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 8. Did you know that in the Old Testament there are individuals that were called sons of Belial, if you read from the King James Version? The literal translation is worthless fellows, worthless individuals. You say, I thought that every soul was valuable, that every person has value in the eyes of God. And that's true. Again, Jesus said, yeah, your soul is worth more than all the world's treasure. But the same God who said that said, however, there are some people who are absolutely worthless. They have no value. A number of decades ago, in our part of the world, that would have been largely an academic question. But we are living in a world that is becoming more and more violent, more and more worthless individuals, sons of Belial. You see them on the news on a regular basis who have no respect for human life, no value for the lives of innocent people, no respect for authority. They're out there. And as our society continues to degenerate morally, you will become more and more likely to encounter these individuals. I think it's important to understand that there are some people who, because of their own behavior, God considers them to be worthless. And it's not because their soul doesn't have worth, but remember that the souls of their innocent victims do have worth. And going all the way back to Genesis chapter 9, that was the deciding factor. It's not because the murderer wasn't valuable, but the life of his innocent victim was valuable, and that's why he deserves to die. As one cop that I've known, faithful elder, faithful child of God, cop for many decades, as he put it, some men need killing. And I think he was exactly right about that. You can find it in the Old Testament, you can find it in the New Testament as well. Finally, some people say, well, preacher, you should just trust God with all of this. Just trust God and pray your way through it. I believe David was a man who trusted God, even as he picked up the stones, even as he loaded them in his sling, even as he hurled them at Goliath. He was trusting God through the whole process. This takes away nothing from our trust in God. One other passage, Psalm 82, verse 4, Psalm 82 and verse 4. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. Is that a principle that still applies today? I believe it is. So let's do that. Let's do that. Good question.